critters can't get their claws into the lining of your gut as easily because of that enhanced barrier function provided by the probiotics. The more good bacteria you have in, they police out and push out and competitively inhibit out the things that you don't want. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, let's discuss probiotics and if they can help with IBS and or SIBO. These are two very important questions because IBS affects up to 20% of the US population, and maybe as much as half of that IBS may be underlied by SIBO. So this tool of probiotics potentially has merit. There's a lot of confusion about how or where to not or to use probiotics as it regards to SIBO and IBS. So what I wanted to do here is provide you with a really data-driven, objective overview of both sides of the arguments on yay or nay for probiotics in these conditions and let you decide for yourself. So we'll discuss probiotics for IBS and probiotics for SIBO. And the first question is, can probiotics help with IBS? Specifically, Dan asks, I recently saw a video online from a doctor talking about IBS. He said probiotics should not be used for the treatment of IBS. What would you say to this? Okay, so let's break this down. The answer here, I think, is very well exemplified by this data point, a meta-analysis from 2020, and they conclude supplementation with a multi-strain probiotic can improve IBS symptoms. So I think this is fairly clear cut. And another study here, different meta-analysis in Beneficial Microbes 2022. And this study actually compared probiotics versus medication. So for those who say, don't use probiotics, use a medication, this study looked at that. One of the medications was rifaximin, which is FDA approved for IBS, and I have no opposition to it. But consider this, their findings, or one of their findings, is that global IBS symptoms were reduced more by probiotics than they were medications. Now, to be careful, in this meta-analysis of 32 clinical trials, it was found that drug therapy was more effective for bloating. But for overall IBS symptoms, probiotics had the edge. There was also a lower incidence of adverse events in the probiotic group. So these two data points are hopefully able to help you have confidence in the fact that probiotics definitely have a time and a place in the treatment of IBS. It doesn't mean they have to be either or. You could use both simultaneously. As an example, rifaximin and probiotics, when used together, are actually more effective than either alone. So to the question of can probiotics help with IBS? Yes, there is an overwhelming number of data points supporting that probiotics can help IBS. Now, that's not to say every person everywhere will benefit from probiotics if they have IBS, because some with IBS can be quite reactive. However, that reactivity can be improved by probiotics in many cases. But again, like anything else, there will always be a smaller subset who may not tolerate that sort of therapy. And this is where you have other options like drug therapy. So definitely consider a probiotic if you have IBS. It's inexpensive, safe, effective, and may actually help with other symptoms like mental clarity, mood, joint pain, and skin. There's varying levels of evidence, but evidence nonetheless that probiotics may help multiple systems of the body. The next question here is one that I love. Can probiotics help SIBO? And frustratingly, admittedly, there is still debate here, even though we have ample evidence to answer this question. But let's look at Jan's question and then also really examine both sides of the data on this argument and then let you make up your mind. So Jan's question, I have IBS and I have just also been recently diagnosed with SIBO. I don't want the probiotics to fuel the SIBO in my gut. Should I avoid probiotics because of my SIBO diagnosis? This is a great question. So we'll break this down into a few different lines of thinking. There's really mechanistic thinking in terms of what's going on underlying SIBO. And then there's also clinical trial outcome data. This is much more important, but we'll look at both. One point here is that there is lack of agreement in terms of what probiotic is the best probiotic for SIBO. Now, there's different ways that we can interpret that. You could say, as I do, there are many, many clinical trials, even meta-analyses, as we discussed a moment ago, that find that probiotics can help with IBS and with SIBO. However, they use different formulas. I look at that as, great, this means different formulas can all be helpful for SIBO. Others may say, well, no, until we know what the best probiotic is, we shouldn't be recommending probiotics. I hear that argument. I don't think it's a great argument because probiotics are not expensive and they're not invasive. Now, if this was a very expensive and very invasive intervention, then yes, we may need to have a high degree of specificity with the recommendation in case it could harm someone. But at very worst, probiotics may cause some temporary discomfort and you stop and that goes away. So the very rare, but sometimes reported side effects from probiotics will go away almost immediately, yet there is a really large upside. But I hear the argument. I don't think it's a good argument, and it's really letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. The other point here is what I want to unpack in a bit more detail. There is this fairly pervasive canard that probiotics can worsen SIBO by colonizing the small intestine and increasing gas production. So argument point number one, probiotics worsen SIBO. And there's two studies here that are often referenced. The first one here by Satish Rao, who's been on the podcast, I believe, twice today. Really appreciate Satish and his work and generally agree with his approach. But this is one study that I really did not agree with. And here's the summary. Those who had SIBO and brain fog were all assessed, and they found that there was a significant amount of people who had SIBO and brain fog who were also taking probiotics and or consuming yogurt. So essentially they found a group of people, again, who had SIBO and brain fog, and they noted that a fair subset of these people, a significant subset, were taking probiotics and or eating yogurt. So this is just observation. Then the intervention was stopping probiotics and starting antibiotics. Their brain fog and their SIBO improved. The author's conclusion was the use of prolonged or excessive probiotics and or cultured yogurt further contributed to the small intestinal colonization by lactobacilli and other bacteria. Okay, there's a few obvious problems here, and if you're a science geek, that these should pop right out to you. But conflating cause and effect, because people walked in using probiotics or eating yogurt, does not mean it was the cause. That's like saying people who go on diets are overweight because of the diets. It could very well be that people who are on diets or maybe using diet sodas are using those things because they're trying to lose weight. So this conflation or this hypothesis is akin to the conflation of saying that those who drink diet soda are overweight because of the diet soda. And like I'm noting here, those with SIBO and IBS are probably more likely to use these things that can help with those symptoms, yogurt because of the probiotics or probiotic supplementation. And the most striking error here, which really surprised me, Satish, with all due respect, the improvement after taking antibiotics does not mean that the observation of taking probiotics prior was causal in the SIBO. What the study did find was that people who had SIBO and brain fog, who were then treated with antibiotics, saw improvements in their SIBO and their brain fog. It's very different than saying probiotics caused SIBO and brain fog. And why this is upsetting, as I'll share in a moment here, is because of the clinical trials showing that probiotics can actually eradicate SIBO. But, this is one of the data points that's often cited. I see it, and I have done an extensive review on this paper in our clinicians newsletter. It's interesting, and I appreciate the thinking, but there's a lot of inferential hypothesis here, and I think that is something that can really get us into trouble. We have to be careful with. The second study that's often cited looked at 19 healthy individuals, and they performed pre-post SIBO breath tests after being given probiotics. And the details here matter. Probiotics did lead to higher methane gas in 3 of 19 people. There was no change in hydrogen, and there was no change in symptoms. So this is one data point. And as you've probably heard me say in the past, in any body of literature, we can find a data point that suggests whatever we want to believe, right? Whatever side of the argument you fall on, you can find a data point to support that. What's important is that you don't cherry pick. Definitionally, this is what cherry picking is. And you look at the totality of the data. So enter meta-analyses, which we will come to in a second. But I first want to go to the mechanism of SIBO, or the anti-SIBO mechanism of probiotics. This paper did a great job of breaking this down. So there's 6 points here. Enhancement of epithelial barrier. So you essentially have a healthier gut lining, and this helps to secrete mucins and defensins, or essentially allows you to be less amenable to infection or overgrowth. So there's enhancement of the epithelial barrier, 1. 2, increased adhesion to the intestinal mucosa of the probiotics. 3, really important, inhibition of pathogen adhesion, meaning critters can't get their claws into the lining of your gut as easily because of that enhanced barrier function provided by the probiotics. 4, policing, competitive exclusion of pathogenic microorganisms, meaning the more good bacteria you have in, they police out and push out and competitively inhibit out the things that you don't want. And maybe the most too important here, production of anti-microorganism or antimicrobial, antibacterial substances, and the clinical trials substantiate the outcome of clearing SIBO. So we'll tie the mechanism to the outcome here in a second. And also very important, modulation of the immune system. And this is where people may notice they have less brain fog, less fatigue, less food reactivity, less environmental allergies, as has been shown in some studies wherein, let's say, seasonal allergy or conjunctive rhinosinusitis are improved from probiotic supplementation. So this is the mechanistic underpinning, which combats the other mechanism of saying, well, if you take probiotics, they'll build up and they'll give you SIBO. Okay, well, I'll trade you that mechanism for this mechanism. Fine, okay, we can debate and bandy mechanism. Now let's go to the outcome data. 2019 clinical trial. This is one of the more compelling data points. They found a 71% reduction rate of symptoms in those who had IBS and SIBO, as compared to an 11-point reduction of symptoms in those who had IBS alone. Meaning, we have all these people with IBS. We're going to give them all probiotics. We'll break them down into those who have IBS and SIBO, and those who have IBS and do not have SIBO. And we see a 71% response rate in those with IBS and SIBO, and an 11% response rate in those who have IBS and don't have SIBO. So this study literally documented that probiotics work better if you have SIBO for your IBS symptoms. But that's not all. Probiotics versus rifaximin for SIBO. So now let's do a side-by-side. We're comparing a meta-analysis of the efficacy of probiotics for SIBO against a meta-analysis of rifaximin for SIBO. What did they show? The pooled SIBO decontamination rate with probiotics, 63%. The pooled eradication or decontamination rate with SIBO, 59%. So similar, but that's the point. There's a similar eradication rate of SIBO with probiotics as there is with rifaximin. There are more datum, but hopefully that suffices in helping you to see, okay, there are 2 studies that people point to. The one study by Satish Rao, which was very strongly repudiated by follow-up responses because his data did not support his hypothesis. The second study that did show 3 of 19 people had an increased level of methane after using probiotics, no change in hydrogen, and no change in symptoms, most importantly. So there's that pitted against the 6-point mechanisms of how probiotics are antimicrobial and improve your gut health and your gut immune function, along with the clinical trial that found probiotics work better if you have SIBO, and then the comparative meta-analyses of multiple clinical trials finding that probiotics are similar in their effectiveness as rifaximin for the treatment of SIBO. So taken together, these data should tell us that probiotics are certainly something to consider for the treatment of SIBO and for the treatment of IBS. Okay, this is Michael Ruscio, and I hope this helps you navigate this contentious landscape of how to treat your SIBO and or your IBS. And the short story there is use probiotics.